What's up, guys? Welcome to the second episode of my new vlog, where today we're going to talk about nationalism and political identities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So let's begin. The first part is about Asian paths to autonomy. So it basically talks about India and China. So India first. India basically wanted home rule, so they wanted freedom away from the British, and there were two groups who were advocating for this, and it was the Indian National Congress or the Muslim League. And so these two groups are really important. And so after World War I, they wanted to achieve independence, and they were inspired by two people, sort of. And that was Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, and the Russian Revolution. And then they weren't happy with the Paris Peace Settlement because they didn't get any independence. And the British didn't care for them either, as they repressed them severely. And so there was this dude named Gandhi, who's also important to know, and he basically wanted this Indian nationalism. And he was a Hindu, but he studied in London, and then I guess he spent time in South Africa, and then he developed tolerance and nonviolence, and later he became known as the Mahatma, or the Great Soul. And then he basically didn't want the caste system, and he wanted promotion for the untouchables. And so basically he led this big movement in India for all this freedom, I guess. So then that leads us to the India Act of 1937. And then this is when, I guess, the British had already killed a lot of people at Amritsar in 1919. And then they offered the India Act, which was a new type of act that allowed more Indian control. But this didn't really work out because the Indian princes didn't really like it, and the Muslims didn't really like it either. And the Muslims had their own self-distrust for the Hindus, and so they wanted their own country. And their own country would be right here, and that own country would be Pakistan. And so that's one of the important, I guess, outcomes of this Indian independence. So a different thing happened in China, and so this is right after, around the time of World War I, and right after. So basically there was a revolution that formed a republic in 1911, and so China sort of wanted to go against the unequal treaties imposed on them. And they really didn't like the Paris Peace Conference because it really didn't help them out. And if anything, it really helped the Japanese. So there was this important movement, and it was called the May 4th movement. And this is when basically Chinese youths, they rose up against the imperialists. And then some of them, like Marxism and Leninism. And this is how the Chinese Communist Party was created. And so there are two groups here. There are the Chinese Communist Party, we'll make them red. So these are the communists. And then there's the Kuomintang, which is actually the Nationalist Party of China. And then we'll call them blue here. And then basically they were led by two people. One is Mao Zedong of the communists, and he wanted socialism basically. But then there was a contrasting dude as the person who actually founded the republic, Sun Yat-sen, and he really wanted democracy and nationalism. And so these two groups basically had a civil war against each other. But before they could do that, they needed to fight off the Japanese who were creeping in on their land. So after Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, then there was a new dude right here. I don't know if you need to know him. But basically, he was trying to demolish the communists. And so the communists had a long march, which was 6,215 miles in 1934 to 35. And that was a super long march. And it showed the Chinese people how resistant the Communist Party actually was. And so Mao Zedong continued to be the leader. And he had his own ideology. And so right after that, Japan emerged from World War I. Remember, they were on the Allies. And then they participated in League of Nations, and they were basically with the U.S. against China, sort of. And so the Japanese were helped by the war as they sold munitions to Allies. But soon after, of course, the Great Depression started plaguing everybody, and then there were problems. And then so in 1931, they decided to invade Manchuria, which is like the northern part of China next to Russia. And then so basically what happened was, I guess the biggest thing is the troops destroyed tracks on the Japanese railroad, and then they claimed the Chinese did it. And this is one reason for World War II later on. And so basically, Japan was deciding to be really imperialistic, and the League of Nations wasn't happy. As you remember earlier, Japan joined. So right now, since they wanted their own ideas, they decided just by, hey, let's leave the League. And so that's just what they did. And then, of course, this is another cause of World War II. All right, so the second part is Africa under colonial domination. Basically, there were colonial powers all around. So it's like Germany, of course, but also Great Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, all these, I guess, big European powers. And the British basically wanted to continue their naval supremacy, while the French wanted to, regain the land lost to Germany as a result of German invasion into France. And then the Germans were really just trying to rebuild after their devastating war. And so Africans, many of them, impressed into the war, and then they fought on their European colony sides. And then many of them saw that European presence became thinner, so they saw that, hey, because of this war, lots of Europeans were actually leaving, and this was good. And then so many of them decided to rise up, and this is the first instance of rising up, although it didn't really gain too much momentum. So basically, the economy was still the same. Europe dominated, and then they kept Africa to themselves. And basically, they maintained Africa as a colony organization. And they also kept the export-oriented economies, basically draining all the African resources. The next part is, basically same thing, more descriptions about how Africans were utilized by the Europeans. And so African nationalism came up afterwards because Africans really wanted freedom, just like the Indians before. And then the leaders of this, like the Indians, were elite class who were educated in Europe, so like Enlightenment ideals. And then they were, of course, had high jobs in their home countries. And they basically just wanted freedom. And then there's a special term for them, and it's called Pan-Africanists. And this is really important because this is basically the name for all of them. All right, so the final part, sort of, is Latin America. And then they're struggling with neocolonialism, which is colonialism after the normal age. And then basically, Europe was doing the same thing to them. They were being ruled over by them, and they didn't really like it. And so Great Depression and the Great War, which is World War I, were having big problems on Latin America. And then so many Latin Americans took on communist ideals. And then, but still, Latin America was in a pretty big disarray of a mess, and they didn't really quite get out of it. So then you have economic imperialism, and this is more of the U.S. deciding to come in, and also British investors, but mainly the U.S., and they finally want to come in. So they start dumping these huge piles of money. So like right here is 1.5 to 3.5 billion, huge amounts of money. And then President Taft, I guess he has dollars for bullets, which is this important term over here. The real word is dollar diplomacy, which is one of your vocabulary words. And basically, in exchange for no military intervention, the countries had to trade with the U.S. through commerce. And so this was better because I guess there's no war, but also better for the United States economy because actually getting a military is a big drain. So furthermore, Great Depression causing problems again. And then, yeah, the U.S. maintains its big stake in Latin America, and even so today, you see it in so many places. And so finally, that's pretty much it. The U.S. wanted to cultivate Latin America markets, and this is basically the U.S. and Latin America had big ties to each other, as you can see right here. There were many Latin Americans who migrated to the US, but of course they were deported later. And then companies even use Latin Americans to help sell their products. But essentially, that's all there is to know for this. In recap, I guess I would say that nationalism and political identities were a big deal in the period before World War II and after World War I, and then it was especially evident in three areas: Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and that was because they were the European colonies. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Thanks.